HTML5 without a doubt has amazing built-in support for form validation, which works for most standard use cases using its type, min, max, and pattern attributes. However, as soon as you need to deviate from standard, the shortcomings become obvious. In part 1 of this video, we noticed some problems when creating, styling, and validating a very simple form. To state just a few, we noticed how error messages on pattern mismatch were too generic, and input fields with required attributes were marked invalid as soon as the form loaded. That severely limited our ability to properly highlight fields with failed validation. We added the ability to show custom error messages using pseudo elements, but that introduces two different error reporting systems and gives an inconsistent user experience. Same goes for suggestions and tips, which can be achieved with CSS, but you lack control on when they should be shown. The solution exists in form of great support for JavaScript in HTML5 and a proper constraint validation API, which makes job of developer really easy. In this video, we shall see how to add custom validation and custom error messages with and without constraint validation API. We'll also see how we can either hook up to existing UI for error reporting and tooltips using the API or completely drop it in favor of our own. We'll discover if we want to leverage built-in validation when adding our own validation to specific fields or entirely take over validation of entire form upon ourselves. We'll also learn to control when validation of entire form or just an input field takes place. All of that at the cost of doing some coding in JavaScript, which I assure you is very basic, and even if you are new to the world of scripting, is not difficult at all. I'll explain each step and expect you to follow and write the code by hand. I am Ali from Learn Awesome. Let's start coding. So we're going to start off by adding JavaScript to this form that we created in part 1. So we are going to be reusing that form. So I'm not going to be typing it again. You can refer to part 1 if you want to code along. So as you can see, it has a bunch of validation already placed on it. So if I go to the CSS file, you can see we have made heavy use of this required, invalid, and valid pseudo classes as well as pseudo elements to add a bunch of validation to this form using HTML and CSS. And you can see some of the problems straight away, like invalid styling being applied on these input elements, which have the required tag on them. So we are going to be fixing all of these things, but the objective of our first exercise that we are going to do is involves this alternate email address, which if I can show you in the HTML is of type text and has a pattern attribute applied on it with a regular expression for validating email addresses. So we are kind of doing a custom validation check on it using our own email address regular expression. And let me show you the issue that we are about to address. So let me add values to the required input fields so that we can see the error that pops up if I submit with an invalid email address in alternate email. It says, please match the requested format. Now, this is too generic and too vague an error that appears when we enter something invalid in our alternate email. Okay, I concede that it says alternate email, where it's obvious to many users what an email format is, but we still need a better phrase to appear here. The first objective of our JavaScript code that we are about to write is to remove this pattern validation from this input element from our HTML file and move it to JavaScript. Secondly, we are going to show our own custom error message below this alternate email, and we are going to style it ourselves, right? We are for the first exercise, we are not trying to reuse the HTML5 suggestion, tip, or error format. We are going to add a text right over here with our own custom styling. So with that objective in mind, let's start coding. Let me close this and let's add a JavaScript file and let's name it form to validate.js. JS stands for JavaScript. And before writing any code in this JavaScript file, let's first add it to our HTML element. And the way to add a JavaScript file to HTML file is to use a script tag in the head section. We can define script tag elsewhere as well, but mostly they appear in the head section. This is the most recommended place. And I'm going to use an attribute defer, which I'll explain in a second, and source, which is going to point to our JavaScript file. And I close this.
And we could also write some script as child of these script tags, but we are not going to do that. The source attribute says that we execute the code written in the JavaScript file. All right, for the stepper tag, the way browsers execute scripts is that they start parsing a HTML document line by line from the start, and when they reach the script tag, and if I don't have the stepper element, they're going to execute the code in the JavaScript file. But since this JavaScript that we are about to write is going to make references to the input elements and the form elements that are going to appear later, so that code would fail. So that is why we use this defer attribute that is going to delay the execution of this JavaScript after the browser has gone through the entire HTML document and parsed it into memory, into, as we call it, document object model or DOM, which we are going to manipulate and access and refer to. So let's go to our JavaScript file and write some code. First thing that we need is a variable which is going to point to the in-memory representation of form object. So for that, we are going to declare a variable and let's call it form object, and it's going to make use of a global variable accessible to browser called document, which is the in-memory representation of this entire HTML file. And we are going to use a function available on this, which is called getElements by tag name. And this is going to return us all elements that have the given tag. And the tag that we are interested in is form. And it is going to return us a collection. But since we know that we only have one form element in our file, so we are going to assign the variable the first entry in the collection, which is available at index 0 in the collection. And this is the syntax to do that, right? So after this line execute, which we are pretty confident it would do, the form object would be pointing to this form element in the HTML, the in-memory representation of it. Next, we are going to declare another variable, which is going to point to the input element that we are interested in for the alternate email. And I'm going to copy the ID attribute value of that input element, and I'm going to use another function called getElement by ID and pass in the ID value, and that's it. No indexing required since ID is unique for the entire HTML document, so we can only get one HTML element. If I hover, see, it's not returning a collection, it's returning only one HTML element or null. All right, the third variable that we are going to be using is a reference to the error span element that is going to contain the error message if the value user enters in the input field does not conform to our regular expression. So I'm going to call it alt email error span object. And if I go to the HTML file, it is going to point to this span element that appears right after this input element. Since it does not have any ID or anything, we are going to use a very interesting function available on the document object, which is called query selector. It lets you provide a CSS selector which points to an input element, and then you specify which subsequent element or the adjacent element we need to pick. So we made heavy use of these, like input required plus span after. So we are going to say in single quotes hash alt email, which is the ID selector for CSS, and then adjacent sibling selector symbol plus, and then we are going to say span. And this is going to select the span element that appears after the input element identified by alt email. Next up, we want to be notified when the user presses the submit button and the form is submitted in the form of an event where we can validate the alternate email. So we are not going to validate as the user types. We are only going to validate when the user presses the submit button and the form is submitted. So to do that, we are going to make use of this form object variable that we declared on line 1. and a function available in it, add event listener. And the first argument is the event that we are interested in, and this is the list of all the events, but we are interested in the submit event. And the second argument is the event handler, which can be an arrow function as well, but since we haven't introduced that in our yet another full stack development playlist, I'm going to use a function here, which is called with an event argument by the browser. And here's the body of that event. Here we are going to declare a variable that is going to contain our regular expression. Since we said we are going to do the regular expression check in JavaScript, not in HTML. So I'm going to say const regular expression email, and its value needs to be enclosed not in single quotes but between two forward slashes, and the value is going to be what we entered as the patron attribute value, which we are going to cut, and I'm going to remove this patron attribute from the HTML. Save. I come back and paste the regular expression and see it's not giving me any error or something, which it would if the forward slash was missing. So now we need to validate what the user entered in the input field against this regular expression. And to do that, we are going to use a function that is available on the input element, and we say if, and we use this variable pointing to the input element, and it's the value user entered on this input element is available as a value property on that variable, and since it's of type string, we have a match function available on it, which takes a regular expression as argument. And we are going to pass the variable above with our regular expression to this, and it's going to return true if the entered value matches this regular expression, or in other words, it's a valid email address. But since we are only interested in the scenario where the validation fails, so we can either say equal to false, or rather than doing that, we can use a not operator here, which essentially means if not, and then this expression. So if this expression fails, then our code in these curly braces would execute. And in here, we are going to make use of this error span object and populate its text content property with our error message. And we say entered value does not seem to be a valid email address. Please enter a valid email. Okay, much more descriptive than the vague error we saw earlier. Let's save it. Okay, one thing you must be aware of that the live preview extension sometimes does not work well with JavaScript. So this better be tested with Chrome browser or a browser of your choice. So save everything and open the file in your favorite browser. I'm using Chrome here, and we need to enter all required fields first with any dummy values, and in alternate email I type CCC, which is a wrong alternate email, and press submit. Now, one thing that must be clear, by the time I press this submit button and this event is invoked, the browser is going to validate all input elements, the entire form by itself, and place the results on validity objects on the respective input element variables. Since that was entirely possible that there was other constraints on this alternate email like required min length, max length, and the entered input might violate those. So we are only interested in running our test if the input value has passed all of these predefined HTML5 constraints. So what we are going to do here is we are going to add an additional layer of checks which says alt email object dot validity dot valid, right? And let's just fix those curly braces here. All right, we are ready. Let's go back, refresh the form, AA, BBB, and CCC, and press submit, and nothing happened because what happened? Our code did execute, but the form was submitted. So this is not the same form that you submitted. Since we haven't defined any target attribute or something, any action attribute on our form, it is refreshing the page. So what we need to do is, if our error message occurs, we need to stop the form from being submitted, something the HTML5 does by itself. But since we are writing our own custom validation, if some error occurs and our validation fails, we need to tell HTML5 not to let the form be submitted. And to do that, we need to use the event argument that was passed to us and invoke a special function available on it called prevent default, which means prevent the default actions after this code is executed, which was to submit the form. So this line is going to prevent form from being submitted. Okay, so if I go back, refresh the page, if I go back, refresh the page, again do AA, BB, and CCC and press submit, our error is appearing here. Okay, but it is lacking any sort of styling. So let's change that now. And to do that, we are gonna do another action here. And on our span object, span variable, we're gonna make use of this class name variable and assign it a new class name called error. Now remember, if you had provided any class in here, it is gonna override that with this assignment, right? And since we now have a new error class available, so let's go to our CSS file and do some styling for this class. And we say, let's say color colon red. We want to show our error message in red color. So I press submit again. Oh, I do refresh, do the same thing, press submit, and yes, our span object is appearing in red color now. Now, in case you are wondering why this weird gap is appearing between the input field and the error, remember that in our CSS file, we had this margin bottom property defined on the input element, which is adding a gap after all input elements. So in the styling, we either need to gulp up that margin bottom using margin top with a negative value or add another one here. Either way, I'm not going to fix that right now. Let's go to our second phase, which is to validate the input as the user enters the value in the input element. So there are two ways to do that. I'm going to concentrate on one in which we validate the alternate email once the user has finished typing in the input field and presses tab or selects the next input field. Let's go back to our JavaScript and write some code to do that. And this time we are going to add the event listener to our input element itself rather than the form object. So let's do that. So we say alt email object dot add event listener. And remember, we are adding the event listener to the input element itself this time. And there are two events that we can use. One is focus out, and the other one is blur. Both do kind of the same thing. So we are going to use blur, and we are going to use the event listener. The signature is the same. And in here, I'm going to copy paste this entire event handler. Ideally, we should write a function, which, in fact, let's just quickly do it. Function validate alt email show error and pass in the event function event argument and do this. And in here, in both places, we are going to say we are going to call the function with the argument that we are getting from the event handler so that we can prevent the execution going forward. So I'm going to copy paste and replace the code in both. That is why we are not duplicating our code and adding possibility of mismatch and errors. So now let's see what happens. First off, I save, refresh. Now a BBB, and on alternate email, I type CCC, and as soon as I press tab, you see the error message appears. It validates as soon as I leave alternate email. So if I type something else, DDD, and as soon as I select any other input field, the error, oh, sorry, let me refresh, a BBB, CCC, C, and as soon as I select any other input field, the error is going to appear, right? The third and final and even more instant validation method that I'm going to show you is to validate as the user types. But for alternate email, it is bad because obviously the user has to type the entire email address before you should do the validation. But I'm going to show you the method which would allow you to validate the input as soon as the user types the first character, right? Does not work well for this example, but for other kind of validations, it might come in handy. So to do that, we are going to copy and paste the previous error, and the event that we are interested is called input, and this input event is called as the user types any character in the input field. So you're going to see, so I press save, go back and say AAABBB, and in here I type C, and you see the error message appears. And now I type CC at the rate of DD, and the error message is still there, and I say .com, and the error message did not go away. It should have. What happened? So this means our validation is not properly working, and let's investigate how. And the way to investigate it, since we are using Visual Studio Code, what we can do is we can go to the HTML file, go to this run and debug, and this run and debug button. And what it's going to do, it's going to pop up a new browser window. And if I go back here and place a breakpoint, you're going to see what I mean by breakpoint in a second. I go here, BBB, and in our email, I type C, and the breakpoint is hit. What are breakpoints? Breakpoints let you debug the JavaScript code, and the code execution stops at the location where you have placed a breakpoint. You place a breakpoint by just clicking on the border area on the line that we want to put a breakpoint on. And now you can either step into the function or step over the function. So we have a toolbar over here, which lets you do that. So I want to step in. So I do step into or press F11, and let's see which line is failing. So I press F10. Yes, that line was good. And let's see if this line works or fails. Okay, it failed. Okay, let me remove this breakpoint and see at the rate of dd dot. And before typing m, I go back, put my breakpoint here, and now I type m, and the breakpoint is hit. Okay, step over, step over, step. Oh, I see the problem now. I hope you saw it too. This portion did not execute, which populates the error message, but we never cleared it out either. So we need to clear out the error message that appeared when we typed as we were typing the invalid error message. So to do that, what we need to do is add a else clause here, that if the value is a good match, right? It is the input is properly matching. We should not be showing an error message. And to do that, we're just gonna clear the error message by assigning it an empty string. And also, we're going to remove the class error class from this error span element. So I'm gonna press continue, press save, go back to the form, refresh, AABBB, and now cc at the rate of dd dot, and the error message should disappear. Now, yes, it did, and it's gonna continue to disappear until I type more than 5 characters. It's gonna repair, yes. So our regular expression is working. We had a 5 character, 2 to 5 character limit on the domain name, so it's working. Okay, so far so good. We have our validation running on all three things, character by character, when the user types something and goes out of the input element, and validation on the submit button press, right? Uh, but we still have a problem of inconsistency. So if I type invalid pet name and press submit, I'm getting the HTML5 format error messages, but if I type something wrong, I'm getting this sort of error messages. So let's fix that. So in our code, let's first get rid of our span element that we are using to show error. Since we are not going to be using that anymore, we are going to use HTML5's built-in constraint validation API to do so. As mentioned in part 1 and in beginning of this video, HTML5 provides something called a constraint validation API, which not only allows you to set your custom validation results on the input elements, but also lets you leverage its own UI for reporting errors to the user, consistent with how the type and attribute based error messages appear on the screen. So to leverage that, what we need to do is we simply need to, instead of this, on the variable for the input element, we need to call a function set custom validity and pass in the error message. So let me copy and paste error message here. And we don't even need this preventive fault. It's gonna invalidate the input element and prevent the form from being submitted. Now, a thing about this set custom validity, it indicates that our custom validation has failed to HTML5 if we pass a non-empty string as an argument. But we also need to indicate the success of our validation operation by calling the same function with an empty string. So this means indicate full custom validation to HTML5. Right? Let's check that if it's working. So let's check using our run and debug. We go here, A, B, 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 and C, C, C. Okay, interesting. It did not work. Let's press submit. And for sure, entered value does not seem to be valid. We are now getting our own custom validation message as in the HTML5 format, but only when we press the submit button, not as we type, even though we can clearly see that our function is being called for the input event as well. Now, why is it happening? It is happening because setCustomValidity has a limited scope. It only invalidates the element. It does not instruct the element to show invalidity status to user as an error message at the spot. It only does so when the user presses submit on the form. So to get that working, we additionally need to call another function, report validity, and this would instruct the input element to immediately show the validity status to the user, which in our case is going to be the error message that we are trying to show the user. So let's see if it works. Save, refresh, AAA, and in alternate email I type, aha, we see the error message is appearing, and we say AA at the rate of PB. Oh, now we have fixed one problem, but we still have another problem. All right, let's investigate. So let me go back, put a breakpoint, and remove one character, which should still result in a valid email, and the error should not appear. Okay, we go back. I do step over. Oh, do you see the issue? It jumped from this if statement right to end of the function. So the current value was never evaluated against the regular expression. And if we hover over this valid property, we see that it is false. And why is it false? Because setCustomValidity invalidates the input element in a sticky fashion. You can say once it has been marked invalid, it remains invalid unless we mark it to be valid again. So to make sure this checks runs as it was before, we need to remove the custom validity before doing our evaluation. And the way to do it is copy this, and in the start of our input event handler, we set the custom validity to empty string, which essentially means the input element is valid unless we evaluate and mark it as invalid in our event handler. Okay, let me remove this breakpoint, press save, press go back to the form, refresh, ABBB, and in alternate email, we type ab at the rate of cd.com. And yes, that fixed the problem. So our custom validation and custom errors are working. We are sure of that. But what about non-custom errors? The HTML5 attribute-based constraint errors. So let's check that. Let's go back to our code and head to HTML file, and in here let's introduce a min length constraint of, let's say, 3 on the alternate email. Okay, let's go back and check. So I type A, B. Now I should have seen the error, right? But I didn't. So I type at the rate, and now on the third character, my invalid email error did appear, but not the min length error that we have entered less characters than minimum threshold. But let's see something very interesting. If I delete a character, now the error appears, right? Okay, let's investigate why this is happening. And to do that, first off, let's go to the code. And can you pause and figure out what's going wrong here? All right, let me tell you. So this line is the problem. When you enter the first character or the second character, this if clause is evaluating to false because the evaluation on the user input takes place before invoking these event handlers. And so these event handlers find this valid object to be false. So let me demonstrate. So I go back uh, and I say A, B, C, D. Now I can't type D because the breakpoint has been hit. So it got hit on the third try when this valid was true, right? Okay, that explains why we did not see the error in the first attempt. Now, why did it started appearing when we started deleting the characters? The answer lies with report validity. So listen to the next sentence very carefully. If the input element is in invalid state, it has been marked invalid, and you call report validity, the input element would continue to report the error until it gets in the valid state, at which point the report validity would be reset. Right? Let me demonstrate it real quick. So let's say I comment it out and introduce a variable out of say x equal to 1. And I'm using let because we plan to change its value. And now here I'm going to, in the input handler, I'm going to say if x equal to 1, then alt email object dot report validity and x equal to 2. So this would ensure that when I enter the first character in the input element, this report validity is going to be set. We should be seeing the min constraint error at this stage, and then this statement will never be executed again. So this is the only report validity in our example case. So let me refresh. I said type AP. Now I type A and we immediately see the constraint error B at the rate of, now we have the email address issue cd.com. Now the error went away because we have a valid email address. Now I start deleting and you see the error never appears again. Even if I type it again, it's not gonna appear again because report validity was reset once the element changed to valid state and then it was never reapplied. So it never took effect. So let's fix that and let's remove this experimental code and right from here let's bring it back, or rather let this be applied either way, whether the actual validity was valid or not for email object. Otherwise we could also apply it on the else clause. In fact, that would probably be better. If it's valid, then report valid if something changed here. Otherwise, if it was invalid to begin with, we show the default error with this report validity. Now let's quickly check A, B, now A, B at the rate of cd.com and the error appears and keeps appearing. Okay, just keep a note of this weird behavior and just always keep that in mind. because it definitely affects the UX. It should be consistent always. User should not be getting surprises like I demonstrated just a minute ago. In fact, with this else clause, I can demonstrate something even more interesting. So do you remember what started this whole experimentation? It was the vague error message for the pattern mismatch that started it all. So here in this code, you have actually the opportunity of customizing the error message itself. So here we did the evaluation completely. We removed the pattern attribute, did the regex validation here, showing a custom validation here. And in the else clause, we are reporting if the default error if let's say the minimum length attribute is being violated. But let me show you something interesting. So I put a breakpoint here. I go back to the form and I type A. Okay, the breakpoint is hitting. It is about to show my error. But let's evaluate this alt email object in the watch window. So I double click. In fact, we can do dot validity and it shows us the validity state for all the validity checks that were performed. And you can see some familiar faces, pattern mismatch, which was the error if we have a pattern attribute defined, range overflow, range underflow, these are min and max errors, step mismatch, too long, too short, and interestingly, there is just one true variable here, too short. So this is the error that we are receiving and which is about to be reported to the user. So we can intercept the error like we are doing here and show user a customized error instead. So let's quickly do that. So let me just let it go and let's copy this, paste it here, and we say if alt email object dot validity dot too short, then entered value is too short should be at least 3. Now this is a custom error message, no, not the default one that we were seeing earlier. Please lengthen this text to 3 characters or more, right? Okay, so let me refresh and see if we see some change. See, for the default error, non-custom error, we are now seeing a customized error message in the UI format of HTML file, in the default UI format, right? This is how you can customize the error messages. So you can actually have a bunch of customizations applied with by having if statements or case statements for all of these validations that HTML5 works with. Okay, great. So we are at a stage where we can go over some usage scenarios that might come up in your coding career with HTML5. So first off, now you have a way of controlling what gets popped up as the user types versus as the user submits. And they definitely do not need to be the same. In fact, the pop-up for as user types can be way more or way less descriptive or suggestive compared to as user submits. You can even change the tooltip based on what has been typed so far. For example, just saying if the user is passed the @ and email address, you can change the tooltip to say the domain name should be at least 2 characters and max 5 characters or something, giving the user dynamic feedback. However, on the submit event handler, You can change the message to include all the rules that apply for a valid email. I hope I was able to convey my point that you now have the tools to control and differ between dynamic and final feedback messages. Secondly, you are now in control of when your form validation takes place. For one specific input field, we chose to validate on all three events: input, blur, and submit. But you can control it for each and every input field individually. In fact, you can disable the validation that takes place when you submit a form by using a form obj dot no validate property by assigning it a true value. So now if you go to your form and let's say I just press submit button, notice it allows me to submit the form without even providing the required values, which it something it was not letting me do earlier. So if I, let's say, remove this and refresh, and now if I try again, see, I get this please fill out this field error. But one thing to keep in mind is it only disables validation on submit operation, not the validation that takes place on the individual event handlers. So let me show you what I mean. So if I go here, I still, oh, sorry, let me reinstate that. So no validation is true. I refresh the form, and if I come to alternate email and I type A, you see it's still showing me the entered value is too short, email address is not valid, etc. etc. But if I press the submit button, it would still let me submit the form with an invalid email address. So if you use this flag in script, then you are totally responsible for making sure the form is not submitted when you in your submit handler, right? By using this prevent default and other means. So this no validate also has a counterpart in the form HTML element as well as a no validate attribute. So both of these do the same thing. They have the same behavior. Well, you do need to know that there are two functions that are extremely valuable when using this no validate flag. One is check validity on the form object. So in the submit handler, you can use that to check the current state of the form. So if you do const is form valid equal to form object dot check validity, and this is going to return true or false based on if any of the input element is in invalid state, this is going to return false, otherwise it's going to return true. So we can quickly check that. If we go to our form, so back dd submit, and the form validity is returning as false because we have invalid state elements. However, if I go here, bb and aa@bb.com, and now press submit, check validity on form object is returning true. So the form should be good to submit. So the second function that I was talking about is prevent default. We have already discussed that. So we can, based on the isForm valid return value, we can decide whether we want to prevent submission of the form to the server or not. So we can just say if not isForm valid, then event dot prevent default. Okay, our form should not be submitted now. So if we go back, keep an eye here, refresh, and now if let's say I do dd and press submit, the form did not get submitted. Our validation is working. But if I give proper values, then the form is allowed to be submitted. One more thing to note, this check validity exists not only on the form object, but also on the individual input elements as well. So if we want to check whether the alt email object is valid or invalid, we can do that too. So for example, if I do const is alt email valid, I can say alt email object dot check validity, and we should be able to check this. So if I put a breakpoint here, go back, refresh, and I say at the rate of b.com, I press submit. Now the form should be invalid, but the alt email should be valid. So this is true, but the form validity would turn out to be false because we haven't entered the required input field, and hence it would prevent the form submission. One interesting thing about this check validity, which I forgot to mention, is that if here we are calling it explicitly because we have this noValidate equal to true, but if not, if this line is not here, it is invoked behind the scene when the form is being submitted. So before the submit operation, check validity is performed, and the form raises invalid elements on all the input fields where the validation has failed. And that event can be captured and put to use for non-default UI, or if we are trying to avoid the HTML5 error messaging UI in favor of our own. So let me demonstrate it real quick. So to do that, let me comment out the entire JavaScript almost, and if I go to CSS, let me uh, comment out all the pseudo classes and pseudo elements based logic. So if I go back to my form and refresh it, it's a very default form with uh, just default styling, nothing to do with validation. So now if I go back to my JavaScript and let's write some code. So to do that, we are gonna say, we are first gonna get a list of all the input elements. So we declare a variable all inputs and say document dot query selector all, so that we can get all elements that span our selector spans. And here we are gonna say input, and it's gonna return us all the input elements. And we can use the comma separated selector to include things like select, text area, range, all kind of input elements that we want, really. So now what we are going to do, we are going to iterate over all inputs and register an invalid error event handler. So for to do that, we are going to make use of a for each function on this all inputs array element, and this is gonna give us a callback function. So we say function input lm, and in here we are going to register the invalid on the individual input element. So it's gonna call this function for each input element one by one. So for the given input element, we say add event listener, and the event name is invalid, and then we write the function in here, and we say input element dot class name equal to error. Okay, so if during form submission any input element is found to be in invalid state, our callback is gonna be invoked and we are going to assign it our own custom class error. Now we have removed all classes including this error class, but I can bring it back to life in the uncommented state, and I can say let's say instead of color red I say border color red, so that we can actually see that in action. Alright, so now I go back to my form, I refresh it, um, and let's say I just go ahead and press submit. So see, it gives me the error pop-up on the first required element and also makes them red if I select anywhere else. Why didn't it make the alternate email red even though we had the if I remember correctly, we had the min length equal to 3 set on it? That's because we did not have required attribute set on it. But let's say if I add some invalid value here and press submit, then all three um, invalidated input elements are marked with red borders. Right? You can do a lot of styling in here, including this showing um, error messages using the pseudo elements underneath these input elements, just like we did in the uh, start of our coding exercise, like this, remember? But I'm not going to demonstrate that. We are way past our deadline. So I think we have pretty much covered everything there was regarding the uh, form validation using JavaScript. If you feel that something got left out, please let me know via comments and I'll try to include that in some future video. If you liked the content, please don't hesitate to give a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel to be notified of upcoming content like this. I hope you learned something useful today. Thanks for watching.